So, respected President of India Islamic Cultural Center, Janab Salman Khurshid Sahab, distinguished guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very warm evening to you all. On behalf of India Islamic Cultural Center, it's my privilege and honor to warmly welcome each one of you to yet another edition of IICC Dialogue, a platform dedicated to fostering informed and meaningful conversations on issues of national and global importance. The India Islamic Cultural Center has always believed that meaningful dialogue is the cornerstone of mutual understanding and peaceful coexistence. It was with this vision of our President that we launched the IICC Dialogue series in November 2024. Today, with the continued support of Mr. Iqbal Ahmed and Mr. Siraj Hussain, we are proud to present the 9th dialogue in the distinguished series. Since its inception, the IICC Dialogue have brought together eminent diplomats, policymakers, academicians, journalists, jurists, public intellectuals to deliberate on issues of contemporary relevance. Our previous discussions have covered themes such as Look Out for West Asia, Looking Ahead, India's Neighborhood Diplomacy, the Constitution of India and Indian Judiciary, State of Media in India, and many more alike. Today's dialogue comes at a particularly significant moment. The theme of this evening's discussion is US-Iran MoU Uncertainties and Possible Consequences. The evolving US-Iran relationship has important implications for regional stability, global geopolitics, energy security, and India's strategic interest. To help us better understand these developments and their possible consequences, we are privileged to have with us an outstanding panel of experts. It's now my honor to introduce the panel. Our first panelist, Professor Achin Vanaik, is one of India's foremost political scientists, an internationally acclaimed scholar and former professor of University of Delhi, an authority on international relations and global politics. He's an author of widely acclaimed The Furies of India, Communalism, Religion, Modernity, and Secularization. His scholarship and independent analysis have earned him immense respect in academic and policy circles. Our second panelist, Ms. Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor of The Hindu, is one of India's most respected journalists on foreign affairs with over 3 decades of distinguished experience covering diplomacy, strategic affairs, and international relations. She brings invaluable insight and perspective to today's discussion. Moderating this evening's dialogue is Ms. Nidhi Razdan, an eminent journalist, author, the television presenter, widely admired for her incisive interviews with her deep understanding of national and international affairs. We are delighted to have her moderate this important conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you all to join me in giving our distinguished panelists a warm round of applause.
The power of Suhasini and Professor Vinayak and Nidhi ke mashallah itne log aayenge. Thank you very much for all of you for coming here. And now the floor is all yours.
Nice to see you here, sir. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And आपने at least मुझे तो लगता है आधे से ज़्यादा auditorium भर गया, अच्छा लग रहा है. And what a day to do this discussion. Actually, मैं आपको ये सच बताऊँ. Last week I was a little worried क्योंकि हम Gen Z के protest में इतने we were so caught up in all of those headlines and that news. I was wondering whether we would have anything to talk about today, and have we forgotten that there is still a war going on. लेकिन I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. अभी headline यही है, the war is threatening to engulf more countries in the Middle East. It's apparently going to get worse. And so I think there's no better day than today to actually have this conversation, because this continues to be a serious conflict, which is of course hurting all of us as well. And to begin with then, Professor Achin Vanaik, to you first, the fact that there is now a real threat of more countries in the West Asian, Middle Eastern region being involved. Already we've seen that the Saudis have become a part of this war. Egypt for the first time has said it came under a drone attack. So this is now going beyond even what we saw earlier this year. Are you concerned that this could really blow up into something even bigger?
Yes, of course, because it's expanded, as you said, horizontally. You also have a number of countries nearby that are also much more concerned now about what's happening over there. You also have one person who really can determine the direction in which this thing is taking place, and that is Trump. You also have a certain division within the Gulf countries, which is also creating its own complications and uncertainties. So whereas earlier on the memorandum of agreement represented a certain strategic victory for Iran against all expectations, now the situation is much more uncertain. The starters of this war, of course, was Israel and the United States, and in my view, they had two different aims. The United States wanted a regime change and a subordinate government. Israel has always been much more ambitious. It wants to establish a permanent dominance and recognizes that Iran is in fact the most important barrier towards this, and therefore would have wanted, if you like, its territorial and political fragmentation or a decisive defeat. This has not happened, and that represents a strategic gain for Iran. And then when the memorandum of agreement came about, this reinforced that because of all the clauses benefiting Iran. Now the situation is much more uncertain. You may even have other countries like Jordan and Egypt coming in and helping the states in some way. It's very uncertain. So on one hand, you have the Gulf countries wanting stabilization, recognizing the problems. On the other hand, there are divisions. And really, it's Trump that really will decide in which direction it is going to go.
I just wanted to follow up on what you just said, that it is Trump that will decide the direction this takes. Is this really in his hands anymore? And I ask this because it seems quite clear that he's desperate to get out of this war now. He's got midterm elections coming up in a few months. And yet Iran seems to be the one that is deciding when this war will end and which direction it will take. Has there been a shift there?
Let me put it this way. I said that Trump is, of course, the most important factor. He's extremely erratic. He's a headline, deadline man, if you like. He sets deadlines, he gets headlines, changes his deadlines, and so on. You mentioned the forthcoming November midterm elections, but there is also advice for him from two sources within the United States, which is very pro-Israel and is pushing him to carry it on. You have Steve Witkoff and you have Jared Kushner, who are very pro-Israel. You have, of course, IPAC and others. The change that is taking place is in the public. But do note that very recently the House of Representatives has passed a bill for the fusion of the militaries of the United States and Israel. It hasn't come into effect because it has to pass the Senate. It may not. But it's an indication of the kind of pressures there that are taking place. The division within the Gulf countries are such that UAE and others are also thinking, look, can we move towards a certain victory over Iran? Or should we move in the direction of trying to ease matters? Still very, very uncertain. You bring in Iran, and is Iran a factor in also this war taking place? Yes, because Iran has suffered not just a massive economic defeat in military, it wants reparations. It wants support. The MoU was supposed to provide that. It's not happening. It's taking a harder line itself. But the question is that what does it want? What will it settle for? What will Trump settle for? For example, Iran is talking about getting some kind of continuing income from its control over the Straits, so that any final settlement should allow it to do that. That is not really on. It's one thing to have voluntary payments for services like the Malacca Straits, but Iran seems to want what is called something like, at the very least, the Montreal Convention. I don't know if you know what the Montreal Convention is. So they want something like that. And if that happens in any settlement, it would be set an international precedent that is very dangerous. So Iran, I think, is bargaining that we must have something like the memorandum of agreement, the removal of the sanctions, our ability to actually recover. What about the 300 billion fund that was supposed to be there for us, $2 fund that was here? So they're also playing their own particular game over here, and they're not willing to go along with the Oman proposal that we can have something like the Malacca Straits and some kind of voluntary payments for this and that. So they're using that leverage, and Trump is being positioned to say, we can take out Iran. Of course, crude prices rising and all that creates a problem, and one doesn't know what are the forces that will move it. So
I think by now he's also
uncertain.
issued so many threats that they kind of, he's like the boy who cried wolf, and,
Yes.
and so they're also continuing to do what they have to do. Suhasini, Haidar, on this point of more countries getting drawn into this conflict, and the interesting thing that Professor Vanaik said is that how Gulf countries themselves are so divided. There was a point in the last few months where the Saudis, from all news reports, were actually sort of telling the Americans, you need to kind of cool it. This, we need to find a way out of this. The fact that they've got involved now in the bombings, how serious a development is that?
Thank you, and thank you to the India Islamic Center for inviting me. The fact is we are in uncharted territory, and we've been in uncharted territory since February this year. Let's be very clear, this is a war without a reason. We searched, we looked, we waited for the US and Israel to come up with one reason, one credible reason for the war. Within the first 2 days, the reason we got was from the US Secretary of State, who essentially said Iran did not pose a threat, but we knew that if Iran was attacked, then they would attack us, so we had to attack them first. Now, this has to be unprecedented, that you cannot even manufacture the idea that Iran was going to attack the US, and therefore they needed to hit back. So we are dealing with a war that actually, it's all new. We don't know where it is heading. We see things like a president of the world's most powerful country saying an entire civilization could die tonight, virtually threatening nuclear annihilation. We've not heard of this kind of thing. Since 1945, we have not seen this level of rhetoric. We have not seen the level of threats. So we're looking at things, and every day we come up with something new. And to your question of the Saudis getting involved this time on behalf of Jordan, as well as Kuwait, it is interesting. On the other hand, it could be a symptom of the fact that we are now seeing the Saudis' rivals, the UAE, pulling away a little bit from the war. And, I don't know if any of you did read this Financial Times four-parter that essentially says the UAE is now reaching out to Iran and trying to find ways to at least mitigate the damages to them. I think at the end of the day, all that you are seeing is everybody is making short-term deals in their own interest, but in their own short-term interest, not with a view to ending it. Because there is no end to this war. This war will end when someone decides they have thrown the last punch, basically. And when the US decides that that it hits the law of diminishing returns. I think one has to remember, and this is the problem with this war, is it's been going on every day for 5 months. Tuesday marked 5 months of this war. That we are actually, we're living in the moment. We're not thinking about where they started and where they ended. When they came into the war, after they had given this ridiculous idea that we hit them because they would hit us if they got hit by somebody else, the US put out 4 basic ideas of what their aims were from this war. 1, to end Iran's nuclear capability. Have they succeeded? There's no evidence of that. 2, to end Iran's ballistic missile capability. Absolutely no evidence, and it's not even there in the MoU. 3, that there was this idea that the Iranian regime had really, been very brutal with their protesters in January, and that it was time for this regime to go, but at least to foment enough of a churn inside Iran so that the regime would be overthrown by its own people. That's what the US seemed to suggest at that time. And I think the 4th thing that the US was really hoping for is to somehow stop Iran's support to its proxies. So Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, and all the rest. None of those seem to have really been successful in any visible, tangible way. Instead, there are 4 new collateral issues that the US must deal with. The one is, of course, Hormuz. The idea, and I agree with Professor Vanaik, that it would be very unfair if Iran was to somehow, set up a toll booth and take a kind of fee per container from people. On the other hand, when I speak realistically to shippers, international shippers are very clear that Hormuz cannot go back to the way it was. That in a sense, nobody is going to want to ply new ships into the Hormuz Strait without some kind of assurance from Iran. Now, how that assurance comes about, will Iran give a parchi for every ship that goes by? Will it take a fee for that parchi? Iran has certainly suggested, in terms of international law, that at the most narrow point of 22 miles across, Iran and Oman's international water, Oman and Iran's territorial waters overlap with each other, and there are no international waters there. Therefore, it must be a joint mechanism that somehow looks at it. However you look at the resolution, it's not going back to the way it was. So you have that. You have the fact that the US's own bases are hit, that refurbishing their own bases, putting ammunition back there, putting that credible security back there is going to take several months, if not years. The trust from Gulf partners that the US can help them, can protect them, has in any case gone. Countries like Saudi are looking to countries like Pakistan for security. Other countries are wondering, do we need these US bases, because they haven't really helped us. So that blow to the US's security net in the region is another unlooked for outcome. And I think finally, and you mentioned November elections, Netanyahu is also going for elections in October. The fact is, inflation is rising. However we couch it, whether it's in India, whether it's in anywhere else, in the US certainly it is. People are being affected every day just a little more. And I'll stop with one statistic which we must remember, because we feel somehow this is not our war. So we don't really, if oil prices stabilize, everything works out. But in fact, there's an international agency called IFPRI that has brought out just what will be the impact on Indians if this war continues. So they looked at different scenarios, if it ended in April, if it ended in June, now if it ends in December. And they found that for urban populations, the effect on our incomes will be a 3% cut. For rural, non-agricultural households, the impact will be about 10%, so 3 times that. But for rural, agricultural homes in India, which we know is such a large part, it will be a 30% dent in their incomes. So we are going to see the of this for a while to come, and I think as a result, everything that we are discussing internationally has to be focused as well domestically.
That's actually quite an alarming, sort of study in terms of how it impacts all of us. But, both of you mentioned the MoU, and that is our topic of discussion as well. And Professor Vanaik, I wanted to understand, within Iran also, is everybody on the same page? Are the Revolutionary Guards and the civilian government on the same page on how to proceed? When we saw the fine print of the MoU, on paper it looked like actually Iran had much more to take away from that than the Americans did, including actually leaving it open for them to charge ships to go through the Strait of Hormuz after 60 days, because it said up to 60 days you're not going to do anything. And it unraveled so quickly. So is there cohesion within Iran too on how to proceed?
No, obviously, what's also happened as a result of this war is that the tension of the difference between those that were considered more moderate and the harder line IRGC, of course, has shifted in favor of them. So that even the kind of repression and the kind of opposition to the repression that was taking place has all now been subordinated to the struggle against the invasion. So there's a tremendous reinforcement of the hardliners, and they are very, very adamant. And there's also a certain understanding on their part that, look, our only point of leverage is the Straits of Hormuz. We have to use it to try to get a long-term solution and an end to this war. And here, in fact, the one country that has a clear aim and determination to go ahead is not Trump so much because he wavers here, there. It's Israel. Israel is determined, and this starts from October 7th and the Hamas attack. It saw that as an opportunity for it to go in for a greater Israel, and it has actually done that. It has moved ahead. It has taken more territory in Syria. It has taken more territory in Lebanon. In the few months that it has been in Lebanon, it has committed more suffering for the Lebanese people in the south of Lebanon than in the 12 years between 1982 and 2000, 18 years between 92 and 2000. And the result at the moment is that the picture for Israel is that it's a mixed one. They have not got what they wanted with regard to Iran. There the hardliners are there and they're saying, look, we can't moderate. We should have, actually the memorandum of agreement doesn't say that they can charge money.
No,
it meant
it's just said that
they could actually
up to
sell
60
their
days
oil
it's nothing,
and that there
So
was a
it
waiver
left
on
it open,
sanctions
yeah.
and all that, right? But now they're talking. They want to actually establish a situation which Suhasini has also mentioned, which would set a very serious international precedent and is very unlikely to take place because it will bring all the European countries and other countries around to also start opposing it. So this is a tricky situation in terms of the hardline position here. And we have to look at Israel, Lebanon, and the other aspect of the memorandum, which talks about Iran saying that there should be a ceasefire and a long-term ceasefire in Lebanon. What has happened in Lebanon? What has happened in Lebanon is that the United States, Israel, and the Lebanese government, which is now more pro the US, in spite of divisions there than earlier. And that's because what happened is that after the Assad regime fell, they also felt that now the situation for Iran is much weaker. And that's a surrender agreement, and that is continuing. And Israel wants to continue that struggle, and that puts Iran in the situation of saying that, look, we have to keep on taking a harder line, because look at what they're trying to do towards Hezbollah. Are they going to end up by saying that, look, if you get a good deal with the United States of America, we'll forget about Hezbollah and rely on the United States to stop Israel from going further? I don't know. But the situation there is
I think what
is a
also
very bad one.
adds to the uncertainty is that we're seeing increasing reports again of Trump and Netanyahu not being on the same page, and that adds another layer to this. But coming now to the India question, Suhasini, Haidar, which is that in this situation, and we know where India started when this war began, which was actually to have the Prime Minister visit Israel and be there literally on the eve of the bombardment. Since then, India has tried to course correct and shift its position. What does New Delhi do in a situation like this? Who does it talk to in Iran? I mean, if there is a division within Iran also, and the hardliners are really calling the shots, because let's face it, the Americans killed all the moderates, what are India's options?
Well, let's be clear, India has never had a problem finding someone in Iran to speak to. There's a huge historical relationship. The president of the Islamic Center, Mr. Salman Khurshid himself, was there in what was a bipartisan effort to go for the funeral of the supreme leader there. So I don't think for India the real issue is going to be who to deal with in Iran. It is certainly going to be
for our ships.
Exactly. It is certainly going to be to deal with the sense, the feeling of unhappiness, the feeling of hurt, the feeling that India did not come through when it counted. So that is something we have to factor in. And I'm sure our diplomats understand the reason, for that. For the moment, it seems very clear that the government is decided to take a wait and watch sort of attitude. Every time an Indian dies aboard a ship, then the one statement comes out, whichever country is responsible for the shooting, that person's ambassador is summoned. But beyond that, India is trying just basically to mitigate and manage the negative effects of this war. So if our issue is 10 million Indians living and working in the Gulf region, then there is one mechanism that is just dealing with what are the problems of Indians there, can they get out, can flights be moved, that kind of thing. If the other issue is on oil, is on food, fuel, fertilizer security because of the Hormuz Straits, then they are working to diversify. Sometimes they come up with schemes as they have with ethanol, which kind of fall flat on their face. But the kernel of truth is in there. If they are charging 170 rupees for non-ethanol petrol, they're telling you what the real price of petrol has really become for them, without the subsidies that they give. So the second is to manage the pricing of all these things. We're in a particularly bad year because this war comes in a year when there is certainly a lesser monsoon, if not a failed monsoon, plus higher heat levels than before. Water is in short supply. So this is a particularly bad year, and they have to mitigate the damage from that. And I think the third part of it is the diplomatic part. Somehow working their way back to some sort of balance from what you pointed out, which is this visit by Prime Minister Modi to Israel in February, 2 days before the war broke out, which has had lasting impact on India's image, on India's ability to call itself a kind of, sort of middle, have a neutral stance in all of this. And I would say that a lot of our statements at the United Nations in the last few days, our ambassador speaking in Arabic to talk about India's support to Palestine and the two-state solution, comes from this desire to somehow not make it completely a one-sided policy. So there is all these different impacts, apart from the economic one that we spoke about earlier, that the Indian government has to deal with. When it comes to dealing with Iran, there is an understanding that a lot of damage has been done. I think it is not just about whether India gave support, didn't give support, condoled at the right time, didn't send condolences at the right time. I think one of the big questions is over Chabahar. The fact that India was willing to give up its investment of 20 years in that port from November onwards. This is not because of the war, but from November onwards, basically cut our losses and pull out of there. I think that sent a real message, which we will have to also engage with.
I thought this might be a good time to open it up to audience questions as well. So if you do have a question for the panel, if you could raise your hand, I'll just call on you if anyone has a question. Otherwise, we will continue. Yes, sir. Sir, एक second. आप ये ले लीजिए.
after independence, once we led the entire world in non-aligned movement, SHARC, all these organizations, and we had Nehru, Tito, Nasser, Trinity was there, which was in the leading position once. Now after that, especially after this government, we are losing our status of international stature, and we are feeling that we are almost isolated. Is it not true?
Would you both like to take that? I know Suhasini has written a lot on it, but Professor Vanaik, would you like to take that first?
Well, this Indian government doesn't think that it's isolated. In fact, it's seeking to establish and sustain two important relationships, which is with the United States and with Israel. Much more so than even previous governments because of the ideological affinity between Zionism and Hindutva. So, as far as what it can do, it can't really do much. Like Suhasini said, it can just wait and watch. It can try and cover it up by saying that, oh, we're being very diplomatic and sensible and seeking balance. That's not correct in my view. There's no balance. They're on the side of the United States and Israel. And even though they want to make good relations with Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc., the relations are tilting towards the UAE. And the reasons why they're tilting towards the UAE is also related to the fact that you have the IMEC as one thing, and you also have the I2U2, India, Israel, UAE, and USA. And in both of these groupings, the role to be played by the UAE sport is absolutely central and important. So as far as they're concerned, waiting and watching here, this way here, the point about previously and what earlier thought, etc., is that most governments are dominated by some variant of realist thinking, realpolitik thinking. If you meet any ambassador or ex-ambassador or any talks about real, you know what they will say? Look, be sensible. We have to understand realpolitik, and we have to deal with the way the world is, not with the way that we think the world should be. This is something the former doyen of strategy, the father of Jaishankar, Mr. Subramaniam, used to say. But the funny thing about this term, we have to deal with the way the world is and not the way the world should be, is that the way the world is actually very strongly related to how the rich and powerful think that the way the world should be. Avoid this question of national interest. Understand what national interest is. National interest is not, above all, a term of analysis or a term of guidance. It's a term of justification, because you can justify virtually anything in the name of national interest, which means it is the subjective dimension of the leaders of the governments that plays a very crucial role. Other aspects balancing, okay, that's all right here. And I just want to end by saying one thing, is I'm not that concerned about what this Indian government should do. I'm not in the business of advising it. What I am concerned is the moral dimension is very, very important, because if you are for the poor and the oppressed who do not have power, then the only source of hope for them is, in fact, a strong moral position and a moral statement here. And today you have a situation in which you have European countries recognizing the genocide of Israel, but facilitating it. This Indian government facilitates. Amnesty International just said that they have sent over 2,500 shipments of weapons, but it doesn't even, acknowledge the horror that Israel is doing here. This is something quite extraordinary, and is an indication of the fact that if you really want to change in India-Israel relations, anyway, that's a different matter. But I want to say this, be very careful about aligning yourself with this Indian government, and incidentally, it's not as if the Congress party has done that much. It shifted in 1991 towards Israel, the only settler colonial apartheid state in the world. And apart from Priyanka Gandhi wearing this thing here, and apart from Kerala, because it is an opposition to the left, has in Karnataka or anywhere else the Congress party taken a strong stand against Israel, and they're worried about the fact that this would be seen as appeasement. So we have got a long way to go to try to transform the situation in the Indian context, towards something which I think is very, very important here. And I'm afraid that given the existing situation, it's a very, very tricky situation. It's a depressing situation. It looks as if there's going to be more wartime escalation and so on. Perhaps there might be pressure on Trump because of what's happening in the global economy to move towards some kind of accommodation. But whatever takes place, in my view, if there is going to be some kind of a prolonged ceasefire, it's not going to prevent sometime in the future, again, the eruption of these problems.
So, Hasni, do you want to take on this particular question?
Sure. The simple answer to your question is no. I don't think India is isolated. I don't think a country like India can be isolated. And India is not engaged with the world, and the world is not engaged with India simply because of one or the other policy. They engage with India. And that is why you will see that if you were to look in broad terms, India is part of every international gathering. We've been to the G7 this year. The leaders of Russia, China, Iran, others will come to Delhi in September. We were supposed to have the African leaders here. Prime Minister Modi will go to the G20 in December. I think we have a big test coming up, and maybe that's when you should ask me this question again, which is at the UN Security Council. We have an election coming up next June, where many of our positions may be questioned. But the broader question, I have no hesitation in saying India cannot and will never be isolated. It is too important a country in the world, and it stands for something. But then I agree with Professor Vanaik, because I think India has always had a moral stature and has been able to punch above its weight, given its GDP per capita, simply because it has taken positions that count. Look at just this war. I mean, I'm not even talking about all that has happened prior to 2026. But if you look at just this war, it is a war started by a UN Security Council permanent member. It is a war that has absolutely no basis. The US itself is not saying it was in self-defense, right? So the UN Charter has been broken there itself. Then you come to the next level, which is that targeting has been done by completely unregulated artificial intelligence. That is why a school in which 168 little girls were killed could be targeted, because AI was allowed to use the targeting. You are talking about nuclear threat, or at least nuclear insecurity by the targeting. If you remember at the beginning of the war, Iranians came out and had human chains outside nuclear installations because they were worried that those were going to get attacked as well. So you're doing a lot of things that, tell us that there is no international law being used. The Strait of Hormuz blockade is another part. The double blockade by the US is another violation of international law. So you're seeing international law being hit again, and again, and yet we are not hearing India's voice. And that, I think, is the bigger tragedy than whether we have friends with us or whether Pakistan is a mediator or anything else. A ship with 100 sailors on it gets bombed by the US in the Indian Ocean, not far from India. They had come as India's guests, and yet they are bombed, and yet we are unable to speak about it. Even when Indians are killed aboard some of these ships in the Indian Ocean by our Quad partner, our voice is not raised. So to me, the bigger worry is not who are my friends and who else is standing with me today. The bigger worry for me is, where is my voice?
Sir, one very small question. Why this term MoU? Because traditionally we use ceasefire or peace agreements. Any particular reason for this use of word MoU? And for Suhasini, are we back to a situation where international law is not law, just positive morality or vanishing point of jurisprudence?
As I understand it, the memorandum agreement is a bit more than a ceasefire, because it was supposed to lay the basis for going further and towards a final agreement. which is why it was called a memorandum of agreement here. But of course, what's happened now is all that's happened there. With regard to the question of international law, well, always remember that the relationship with international law and force has always been a relationship with force and international law. Force can change international law. That force can be the force of states and governments, or it can be the force of popular movements. For example, the decolonization process, which then led to changes in laws and so on. But what you're having, of course, at the economic level and the political level, as very recently as Suhasini has also said, you are finding the fact that more and more countries are just exercising their power irrespective of international laws. And this is something that has escalated to a greater extent than earlier. There have been variations in the way in which international law has been respected. Look at the situation in Palestine. What governments are doing anything about it? In fact, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you found a shift globally, which also includes some of the Gulf Cooperation states, in which the states moved closer to Israel. But in civil society, in Europe and North America, and to some extent in Latin America, not in India, unfortunately, are more and more support for the Palestinians over here. So this question of international law, it means that more and more countries are thinking that they can get away by doing whatever, exercise of power. And please understand, this doesn't just mean Israel or US, it means countries like India, which also is a bully in its own area and rationalizes that bulliness in terms of we are important, we are a stabilizing force. It's not just India, it's Iran. It's not just Iran, it's Turkey. It's not just Turkey, it can be other countries also. So the point is that this is also breaking out here. But any idea that this constitutes multipolarity, which is supposed to be a good thing, be very careful. Middle powers are not going to seriously challenge the big two or the big three, and they cannot do that. What they're trying to do is maneuver it in the name of multipolarity and saying, oh, we're doing good. Please remember that all states are structurally biased states, and they're structurally biased in favor of the rich and the powerful, which will change laws as they want to, or if they can, or they will disregard it. But be very careful about identifying yourself in the name of national interests with structurally biased states. You can decide what policies you support, but you should always have as a vantage point, not what is good for India or Turkey or Israel, but what is good for the poorest and the most oppressed sections of society. And maybe this is better than that or that. That vantage point is very, very important. And we miss that vantage point if we fall in the trap of taking this idea of national interest that seriously, because the agent of national interest is supposed to be the state, and states everywhere are structurally biased in a fundamental way. The great difference between Nehru, Gandhi, and earlier is that they fought and were leaders of mass movements and recognized the importance of morality. And therefore, what they had was a greater combination of morality and pragmatism. What you now have is what is called realist pragmatism covered up by references to morality, which is very different from the past.
Quickly answer the bit on international order. You know, there's no question that since 1945, whatever we have thought of as international order and international law is actually very, very badly degraded, to the point I would say that in the next 10 years it will be very obvious that international order does not exist. So what Professor Vanaik is suggesting, that these middle powers, other powers are going to take their chances at doing things which aren't in the greater good of the world, is going to increase. You know, in 2024, they counted 61 conflicts involving state actors, which involved 39 states in all. That is the highest number of such conflicts since 1946. So this is not some made-up figure that international order is going away. The number of conflicts that the UN is able not to prevent or to stop is in fact at a record level. So we are dealing with that. We are dealing with the nature of what the so-called underpinning states, those states that were supposed to guarantee international order, they are the ones that are violating international order. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine comes into that bracket. US's kidnapping of the Venezuelan president Maduro is part of that. Israel, we're talking about Israel, and of course we're referring to the fact that Israel has broken all these, international tenets, the targeting of civilians, 70,000 dead, 20,000 of them children, all of that. What about the UN itself? They have killed more than 100 UN officials in this war. United Nations officials who are never supposed to be targeted have actually died. The UN Secretary General, supposed to be the symbol of the UN, is banned from visiting Israel. He cannot get a visa to go to Israel. So we are looking at a flouting of this international order from all respects. And it's not one or the other, and I agree. It's Iran, it's China, it's so many countries around the world that are doing it, that I do think that in the next few years itself, we need to not just discuss India's position as a permanent member of the UN, reformed UN Security Council. I think we really need to think hard about whether that United Nations has the capacity anymore to say things like never again, to say things like no more nuclear wars. And if they don't, then what is going to do it? There are many suggestions out there already about what can replace the UN. I still think the UN is the most credible organization that has brought these together. But I do think that the conversation on a new international order has to start today itself.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is...
We can hear you.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, the IISS London organized a conference in Delhi, a small gathering of experts and all. So more than half a dozen of India's top military brass were present in that conference. One of the questions that was addressed is the role of Pakistan. And the general answer that came out of it, that it would add the credibility of Pakistan in international sphere, right? The credibility of Pakistan would go up. So as it looks now, that's in doubt. So what do you think, given the developments? Can you shed some light on that? What sort of role Pakistan is still playing, given that Saudi Arabia has become party to the whole process now?
Yeah, Suhasini.
One more quick. Now we have two wars going on, not one war, and both the wars started by the members of Security Council.
That's
right?
correct.
Right?
That's correct.
So we keep reading about it that Russia and China are playing some sort of backdoor role to the whole process, whatever is unfolding. Would like to say something on that, part of it. How does? Thank you.
I'll take the Pakistan question. I think from the very beginning, there's been so much talk about how Pakistan was able to do this and have they, stolen a march on India, our external affairs minister using that very unparliamentary word for what Pakistan was doing. But I think it is very clear that Pakistan played that role for two basic reasons. One, because its leadership had the trust of the United States leader. And second, because it has no diplomatic ties with Israel. So for Iran, the push factor vis-a-vis Pakistan was essentially that they did not want an Israeli proxy in the room, apart from, as he mentioned, the two interlocutors from the US themselves. And I think that is a unique position. That is not a position anybody else can take. If Oman and Qatar also helped with the talks, but Pakistan was, able to provide it at that particular moment when Oman and Qatar were themselves in the middle of the conflict. So I'm not sure that has changed Pakistan's stature in the world. I think it certainly disappointed a lot of people, even within our government, that there wasn't a greater, revulsion to Pakistan, particularly after all that happened last year. But I don't see it as, as a kind of strategic game changer. So I'll just stop there. I think Pakistan was chosen for a specific reason. They, in fact, did a very good job of carrying out the procedure of bringing these interlocutors to Islamabad, to have them come up with an MoU at all. to have them sign an MoU at all, to have the US extend its ceasefire week after week. All of these are, credit to Pakistan for having been able to do it. But I'm not sure that this leads to some new global role for it.
I just want to quickly, just want to quickly ask Suhasini a follow-up. Sorry, on the Pakistan question, because I mean the sort of the Indian social media's obsession with Pakistan in general is embarrassing, but from another perspective, what you said, that Pakistan being chosen for a very specific role, would Asim Munir see it that way, or would he see it as in a sense? A validation of his stature in the White House, and given what happened in Pahalgam last year, we just had another big terror attack where a policeman was killed in Anantnag a few days ago, which was the first major strike in Kashmir since Pahalgam. So is there a worry that this may embolden the Pakistani army to try something in Kashmir or somewhere else again soon?
So obviously that is something India always worries about, that anything that makes Pakistan feel extra confident ends up with something going wrong in India, or certainly at the LOC or the border. Again, I think this is a specific moment in time. Only, frankly, Asim Munir knows what is the conversation he and Donald Trump had in the White House over that lunch on, I think, June 17th or 18th last year. So what was the nature of the questions that were asked, the demand from the US, which we know at the time was that Pakistan should not somehow get involved militarily to support Iran. Because at that time also, attacking Iran was on the US agenda. They'd already carried out one round. What was it that Pakistan asked for in return? Did it ask for a greater role in the neighborhood? Did it ask for example, there's been a suggestion that the US's reversion of Indo-PACOM to PACOM comes from the Pakistani unhappiness over the Indian Ocean, which also has Pakistan also borders the Indian Ocean, as a kind of Indian dominance. Were the requests for more? Were they for talks between India and Pakistan to be pushed? And you mentioned IISS, which has actually been in the news for a different conference in Sri Lanka, where we had a former Indian Army chief as well go, and Pakistani generals were present as well. So we still don't know where that is leading. What we do know is that there is some kind of an understanding between the US and Pakistan right now. There is even the possibility that the US wants India not to up the ante with Pakistan at this time. I certainly thought it was interesting that on the 1-year anniversary of the terrible Pahalgam attacks, that the statements made by the Indian leadership did not mention Pakistan. So we don't know at what point Pakistan has asked for that bargain. But whether it can actually do it, whether it can actually overstep either militarily with India or step out of its current economic situation and make some international splash in the world, I'm not sure.
Professor Vanaik.
To take your second question about China and Russia, well, let's start with the fact that what happened in this war and Iran's attack on the Gulf countries is that the security umbrella provided by the United States is suddenly shaken. Look, what is this? At the same time, even as that means that countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, others and all are saying that, what can we do to make his situation? One, of course, both of UAE and Saudi Arabia are trying to strengthen themselves militarily in various ways. But is there some other option than relying still on the United States of America? Going towards China or Russia? I don't see that. Economically, of course, petrodollars, their connections, investments, and all that are much more with the West, right? It's not as if China or Russia are screaming to come in and to take on that responsibility, anything like that. So yes, you'll have Saudi Arabia as a link with Pakistan, adjusting somewhat, seeing what they can do there. But they're still, in my view, going to rely on the United States of America to some certain degree, unless things change very, very dramatically. As far as Russia and China's support for Iran is concerned, Well, we know that Russia has provided information, targeting information, and all that here. China has provided what? Well, 90% of the oil, of course, goes to China, and they will seek to continue that in some particular way. Very recently, there was news about 400 shoulder-fired anti-aircraft from China to Iran. But the Chinese foreign ministry has said that this is not correct. It seems to be something that is a company in what do you call it, Hong Kong, that is providing this, and it is going to fly from an airport in China towards Pakistan and then to Iran. It's quite possible that this is a private arrangement which the Chinese government is prepared to let go, even as it says no, no, no. But it's not much. The Chinese is not interested in having some kind of a confrontation with the United States of America. In fact, it has a much more reactive and defensive attitude towards the United States of America generally, except in one area. And that is its arrogance with regard to the question of the 9-dash line and the domination of that particular region here. And that, of course, is something here. So I don't see, even as Iran and others may make some adjustment, I don't see a very significant change in terms of them coming in. But what I do see, and I think has also been pointed out, is that the situation there is going to be increasingly chaotic. Because one of the interesting things that we find in the world today, which is so complex, is that the most powerful governments, like the United States, Russia, China, cannot adequately establish the kind of order that they would want. Because life is so much more complex. You have all kinds of intersections between states and states, between states and society, between society and states. And too much of standard international relational thinking is preoccupied with state-to-state relations and not able to comprehend this, let alone the whole question of economy and so on, etc. here. So the most powerful countries in the world are not able to address. And I just want to end here by, do we have any statement or should I stop now? Okay, I just want to say one thing, is that we are faced with 5 problems that can only be resolved internationally, through cooperation of states and much more. What are they? The persistence of mass immiseration and the most incredible inequalities of income and wealth. 2 are connected. Second, connected to this, the undermining of democracy where it exists, the substantive character, and of course authoritarianism. Third, you have the problem of pandemics, now much more frequent than ever before because of what's happening in terms of human society expanding in various areas in there. Fourth, you have the ecological dimension that goes beyond the question of even climate change, biodiversity, and so on. Fifth, the nuclear question. All of these are international problems that can only be addressed internationally. But what is actually happening? What is actually happening is that the states are so preoccupied with what they think is their national interest and so on, that they're not able to actually address this. In fact, on the nuclear question, as a result of what has happened, you have Turkey thinking that maybe we should have it, Saudi Arabia thinking that maybe we should have it, Japan saying that maybe we should have it, Finland and Sweden, which could have done it in 1960 and decided not to, thinking maybe we should consider this here. And of course, all this is going to be rationalized and justified in the name of national interest.
My name is Shahnawaz Abdin. I teach at Jamia Hamdard. Adding to the point of Professor Vanaik, that the recent round of surprise attacks by Iran. So do you see that as an escalation instead of a retaliation? Do you see the recent round of surprise attacks by Iran as an escalation or a retaliation? And will that have a compounding effect on the chokehold of the Strait of Hormuz as well?
It's both a retaliation and an escalation, in the sense that they are saying that, look, we had a memorandum of agreement, we have agreement here, you, the United States, are creating all sorts of problems here, your other countries, you are creating, maybe the only way that we can actually cope is also attack further bases, because the United States has been shipping weapons to Jordan in order to fight there. So maybe by expanding it, we can put pressure. And then this gets connected, of course, to the fact that you have the IGRC in power at the moment, and their thinking is that this may be the best way to move forward. It may not be. It may well be a negative way. This is where the subjective dimension comes in, the uncertainties comes in, other aspects come in. In the case of Trump, his personality is one factor which also brings in a degree of uncertainty in this whole thing. So my response would be it's both a retaliation and an escalation.
So Iran claims that it is following an ideology of resistance against the imperialist powers. So fundamentally, if we think and if we look at things from Western perspective or Western glasses, then we see the world very different. So we use the terminology as hardliner, softliner, IRGC is the hardliner, and these are the softliners. When we know that $950 million is passed by the US Congress to create propaganda against Iran, Russia, and China. So we know what is the source that we look for to ensure that we are not affected by the propaganda created by the West. So this is my point. 2 points. One is this war is not about just two countries. It's about two ideologies, imperialism versus resistance. Second is what is the educated liberal Indian society doing to ensure that we are not affected by the propaganda, which we know it's a propaganda, and we know that America is spending millions of dollars to create anti-Iranian. And how do we get out of this so-called liberal, so-called hardliner, softliner kind of issues?
Look, let me, do we oppose the United States and Israel's attack on Iran and say that it has the right to defend itself? The answer is, of course, we oppose that war, and we have the right to, Iran has the right to defend itself. Gain on the global level in the last 80 years. You know what my answer would be? My answer would be decolonization and the overthrow and the establishment in international law of the importance of national liberation and independence. Right? That's it. When you take that into consideration, then you say that this applies everywhere. So we are opposed to imperialist powers, but should we also not be imposed to the bullying carried out by sub-imperial powers against weaker countries? Is Iran under something of a sub-imperial power? I've already mentioned India. You can add Pakistan. You can add so many others. Of course, if you take a realist perspective, we have to do it for our country, so on here. So if you're taking that point about that, that would be one thing. The second point is that decolonization was the single greatest democratic gain, even when colonial rule and brutality was replaced by tyrants and brutal. It was still a great diplomatic gain. The principle there is that you have to respect the right of a people to overthrow their own tyrant. Is the regime in Iran also a tyrannical regime in many respects? The answer is yes. Is the government in India extremely oppressive? Yes. Is the government in the United States? So on, everywhere. There are variations, and so on. So even as one defends that, you have to also criticize. Let me put it this way. There are three positions you can take. You can take unconditional support, you can take conditional support, and you can take unconditional but critical support. What do I mean? In the case of the overthrow of apartheid in South Africa, I take unconditional but critical support. My support is not conditional. Apartheid must be overthrown. But it is never unconditional. In the case of Iran, this thing, unconditional opposition to the United States and Israel attack, but it will always be critical, even as I support the resistance against it. So you have to decide in a certain sense. Is your report going to be conditional? Is it going to be unconditional? Or is it going to be unconditional but critical in such circumstances here?
I'll just add on the media front. I do agree that there's always the worry of Western propaganda, simply because also we get so much of our news on other countries through the West. Since the Hindu that I work for does try to have reporters on the ground, but we don't always succeed. So a lot of the agencies that we are using will be Western media, Western agencies. But I do think that there's been an exception made during this war. And I think more Indian journalists have gone to the ground. More media organizations are taking, not just reports from the ground, but also experts from the ground, and have had fairly, it's not been a pro-Western kind of impact in the media. And as a result, I do look at public opinion. I think in India you will find public opinion is deeply distressed by this war that is started by the US and Israel. They're also deeply distressed by the impact of what Iran has done in order to, it says, defend the Hormuz Strait in particular, and insecurity when it comes to food, fuel, and fertilizer. But I don't think people have lost that idea. So I'm not sure whether you think that propaganda has had an impact, but we can take the conversation later, maybe.
Thank you. Given the progression and trajectory of this conflict, the US, Iran, and Israel conflict thus far, and Iran's withdrawal from NPT and termination of JCPOA, and China and Russia vetoing forceful entry into Hormuz, does it all mean, and Iran going a little bit dark subsequently, so does it mean that Iran is no more a threshold state?
You'll have to explain what you mean by threshold state. Nuclear threshold, correct. I think the dust has to settle on what we know and what we don't know. It's too early. We've been trying to have the IAEA's reports and look at what they're also able to tell about what is the nature. Because remember, this is the second round of the so-called US-Israel attacks on Iran's nuclear capabilities. That first round was supposed to have completely, demolished their ability, and that didn't, clearly was not the case. So I think it's still a bit early to say. But what I do think is interesting is, again, that MoU seemed to suggest that, that the US was willing to go into talks, that if you remember, Russia made that offer to say we can take over some of the nuclear fuel. So I honestly think there will be a time when saner minds will prevail and get to this this particular issue. But I think it's very early to say where Iran's nuclear program is today.
I'll just add here that when you say threshold state, there are certainly more voices in Iran, even though the clerical leadership has said we don't want it, it's anti-Islamic. But there are certainly voices that are saying maybe we should consider it and we can move. They have not withdrawn from the NPT. They're saying that it's not, we are not respecting it. But if Iran was to go in for nuclear in the name of deterrence, a standard argument, etc., in my view, it would be a mistake, a disaster. Because they cannot, even if they get nuclear weapons, attack the United States. It's not Israel. The United States will come out hard on them. So it would be a very serious mistake. Leave aside the fact about the problems of deterrence, etc. Nuclear weapons are the most powerful military weapons in human history. And yet all countries that have nuclear weapons have lost wars to countries that don't have nuclear weapons, which incidentally suggests that you shouldn't underestimate the question of morality, and even the fact that even the crepos who rule us and all the rest of us, many of them, United States and others, still have a certain sense of morality and sensitive. So the United States public supports nuclear weapons for the United States, but did not support nuclear weapons being used by the United States on Vietnam. So if you like, that moral taboo. And it has lasted for so long since 1945, which makes it more difficult. But we are moving in a direction where that can be broken, precisely because any number of nuclear weapon states are now moving towards having tactical nuclear weapons, considering using it, this, that, etc., even India, Pakistan, and so on. So this really is a very, very serious thing that we have to consider.
I think we can all agree that in a war that is, as we've been saying right from the beginning, riddled with so much uncertainty, none of us really know how this script is going to play out. But I think both Suhasini, Haidar, and Professor Vanaik have given us such a terrific perspective today on so many questions that confront us, whether it is about the conflict itself, its political, its economic fallout. And I think for me in particular, the big takeaway was some of the bigger moral questions that both of you raised, which I think are extremely important and valid today. Please give a huge round of applause to both the panelists. And thank you very much to everyone for making this a wonderful afternoon with a lot of great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't take all the questions, but we tried to do as many as we could. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nidhi, Suhasini, and Professor Vanaik. Thanks, of course, to all of you who came. And अल्लाह ने निधि की ज़बान में वाकई बरकत दी है, आधे से ज़्यादा भर चुका है. आई थिंक 70% कुछ लोग मगरिब की नमाज के लिए चले गए. बट मैं सिर्फ सलमान खुर्शीद साहब से कहूँगा कि 2 अल्फाज आके प्रेसिडेंशियल रिमार्क्स ज़रूर कह दें, उसके बाद वी विल फाइनली रैप अप. प्लीज़ कम सर.
I was sitting there. There were so many brilliant questions that were coming, and I wanted to share with you that my recent visit to Iran was a very interesting one and an eye-opener for me. Perhaps 3 days is not enough to be able to project the truth about Iranian society, but I certainly found them extremely remarkable people. I've been there before, but this was in very special circumstances. They had suffered such grievous loss. They had been presumably shaken up by the kind of attacks that they suffered, and they lost their top leaders of the military as well as their spiritual leader. But there wasn't any rancor, there wasn't any anger, there wasn't any bitterness, just enormous amount of confidence about the way ahead. And it seemed to me that if a country in such circumstances is to be seen and admired for putting its act together, what I saw in Iran was certainly an eye-opener. And something that I specifically noticed, and I do want to say this, and I'm sure that the ladies on the panel will appreciate this, that I was pleasantly surprised to see a lot of women going about in a normal way, some wearing hijab, many wearing hijab, some not wearing hijab, some traveling on two-wheelers on the road, going past the buses and coaches that were taking us. And the photographers that were following us around, at least 95% of those photographers were women. A lot of them were hijab dressed, of course, but they were women. And they were protocol people were largely women. For somebody that believes that Iranian society keeps its women backwards, is I think something that requires to be looked at afresh. But I was very pleased that despite whatever may have happened, and you've just heard about the reactions of our country at various steps when we have been a bit reticent, that we have been a bit timorous, that we've been careful about saying something on Iran. But I thought that they were wonderful with us as Indians. There was an official delegation as well, which went just briefly to make a presentation and return. But I found that they had a very strong urge to keep a solid relationship with India. And when we speak of a civilizational bond between India and Iran, that was so apparent and so obvious in the manner in which they treated us. And I want to share with you the good fortune I had was that at the commemoration meeting, the memorial meeting for the Supreme Leader, now there were various countries, largely from the Arab world and from the Muslim world, who came and made their presentations. And when I was asked to speak, I was chuffed by the fact that the delegation, which was not the formal delegation that I carried, but there were delegation which merged itself naturally, organically, while we were there for 3 days. That delegation had people from several Indian religions, and I was very pleased to be able to say to the gathering there, which was largely a gathering of clerics and people from the world of divinity, that I was very proudly able to say that India is adding to your gathering here today, not merely by saying that there should be enhanced Islamic unity, which is the message that they were all carrying, but that we bring to you a message of enhanced humanity, because we represent here from India people from several religions, which means Islam, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, and Christianity. We all come here today to join you in the spirit in which you celebrate the martyrdom of your great leader and you remember your great leader. We add that element of humanity to it by saying that the humanity today has to come together, because the future of our children depends on how the generations today can come together. So thank you very much for taking this opportunity to come here. I just wanted to add finally that it has been our effort, and I'm grateful to Iqbal Saab and of course Siraj Hussain Saab and Shamama for putting together the IICC dialogues. We want these dialogues to be reaching out to the globe, and I hope that you would certainly add to our aspiration to take this thing forward. We've had a very good audience today, and certainly if we had had your normal place where they have the gatherings, you would have been oversubscribed. So take it that you have been oversubscribed. Thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you.
कंटिन्यू रहेगा IICC डायलॉग.
चलिए अच्छा साहब आइए.